The Wrong Turn in Sarajevo. On the morning of June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie rode through the streets of Sarajevo in an open car. The day was warm. Crowds lined the route. The Archduke was heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, visiting the Bosnian capital for military inspections and ceremonial duties. Security was minimal. The route was published in newspapers. Anyone could know where the Archduke would be and when. Earlier that morning, a group of young Serbian nationalists had positioned themselves along the planned route. They carried bombs and pistols. Their goal was assassination. They wanted to strike against Austro-Hungarian rule over Bosnia. One conspirator threw a bomb at the Archduke's car. The device bounced off, exploding beneath the following vehicle. Several people were injured. The Archduke was unharmed. He continued to the town hall, shaken but determined to proceed with scheduled events. After the town hall reception, Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the wounded from the bombing at the hospital. His security detail agreed, but planned a new route to avoid further danger. They would take a main road directly to the hospital, avoiding narrow side streets where assassins might hide. The route change was decided hastily. Instructions were given verbally. Not everyone received clear communication about the modification. The motorcade departed. The Archduke's driver, Leopold Leuker, followed the original route out of habit or confusion. No one had informed him properly of the change. The car turned onto Franz Joseph Street, a narrow thoroughfare. This was wrong. An officer in the car realized the mistake immediately and shouted instructions to turn back. The driver stopped. He began backing up to return to the correct route. At that precise moment, one of the conspirators stood on that very street corner. Gavrilo Princip was 19 years old. After the bombing failed, he had assumed the plot was finished. He wandered, dejected, and stopped at a delicatessen. He stood on the street, perhaps buying a sandwich, perhaps simply waiting. Then the Archduke's car appeared directly in front of him. It stopped. The vehicle reversed slowly, gears grinding, giving Princip a clear shot at close range. Princip stepped forward. He drew his pistol. He fired twice. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. The second hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. Both victims were mortally wounded. Sophie died almost immediately. Franz Ferdinand lost consciousness within minutes and died soon after. A wrong turn had delivered them directly to their assassin. The assassination triggered diplomatic responses. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the attack. Ultimatums were issued. Serbia refused some demands. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. Germany supported Austria-Hungary. France was allied with Russia. Germany declared war. On Russia and France, German forces invaded Belgium to reach France. This violation of Belgian neutrality brought Britain into the conflict. Within weeks, Europe was engulfed in the First World War. The war lasted 4 years. Millions died in trenches, from disease, from starvation. Empires collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated. The Russian Empire fell to revolution. The German Empire was defeated and humiliated. The Ottoman Empire was dismembered. The map of Europe was redrawn. New nations emerged. Old orders vanished. The world that existed before 1914 was gone, replaced by something darker and more uncertain. Could the war have been avoided if Franz Ferdinand had survived? Possibly. The Archduke favoured reforms that might have eased tensions within the empire. His death removed a voice for moderation, yet the deeper causes of war existed independently of his assassination. Nationalism, imperial rivalries, arms races, alliance systems, all created a volatile situation. The assassination was a spark. The fuel was already in place. Still, a spark is necessary for fire. Without it, some combustion might not occur, or might occur differently later under different circumstances. The wrong turn was not deliberate sabotage. It was confusion, miscommunication, human error. A driver following old instructions rather than new ones. An officer failing to ensure the driver understood the change. These small failures of communication placed the Archduke in harm's way at the exact moment and location where an assassin waited. Timing aligned perfectly. Chance delivered victim to killer. A single turn, a moment of confusion, and history pivoted into catastrophe. An open gate at Constantinople. Constantinople stood for over 1,000 years as the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The city occupied a strategic position at the junction of Europe and Asia, controlling the Bosporus Strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Its walls were legendary. The Theodosian walls, built in the 5th century, consisted of multiple layers of fortifications, an outer wall, a moat, an inner wall, all protected by towers and gates. No enemy had breached these defences for a millennium. Earthquakes damaged sections occasionally, but repairs maintained the wall's integrity. Constantinople seemed impregnable. By the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk to little more than the city itself and some surrounding territory. The Ottoman Empire, expanding from Anatolia, surrounded Constantinople on all sides. Sultan Mehmed II, young and ambitious, determined to conquer the city. In the spring of 1453, he assembled a massive army. Estimates suggest between 80,000 and 200,000 men. They brought cannons, enormous bronze weapons capable of hurling stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds. These new weapons represented cutting-edge military technology. The siege began on April 6, 1453. Ottoman forces surrounded the city. The Byzantine defenders numbered perhaps 7,000 soldiers and armed citizens. The population within the walls included perhaps 50,000 people, though numbers are uncertain. Emperor Constantine XI led the defense. He knew the odds were poor, but he refused to surrender. The city had survived sieges before. The walls might hold again. For weeks, Ottoman cannons pounded the walls. Massive balls smashed into stone, sections crumbled. Byzantine defenders worked through nights, repairing breaches with rubble and timber. The Ottomans attacked repeatedly. Each assault was repulsed. Defenders poured boiling oil on attackers. They shot arrows and crossbow bolts. They threw stones. The walls, though battered, held. Morale among defenders remained relatively high despite the overwhelming odds. The Ottomans controlled the land approaches, but the Byzantine navy, though small, dominated the waters. A chain stretched across the Golden Horn, preventing Ottoman ships from entering that inlet. Byzantine and allied ships kept supply lines partially open. The siege dragged on. Weeks became months. Mehmed's advisors suggested lifting the siege. The city seemed too strong, but Mehmed refused. He increased efforts, bringing more cannons, organising more assaults. On the night of May 28th, the Ottomans prepared a massive final assault. They planned to attack at dawn. Troops massed, ladders and siege equipment were positioned. The defenders knew a major attack was imminent. They prepared as best they could, reinforcing weak points, positioning their limited forces at critical sections. Everyone understood this would likely be the decisive engagement. In the early morning hours of May 29th, the Ottoman assault began. Wave after wave of soldiers charged the walls. The first waves consisted of irregulars, expendable troops meant to exhaust defenders. Then came the more disciplined infantry. Finally, the elite janissaries, the Sultan's best soldiers. The fighting was brutal. Defenders killed hundreds, perhaps thousands of attackers. But the Ottomans kept coming. Sheer numbers overwhelmed sections of defence. During the chaos of battle, a small gate in the walls remained a point of vulnerability. The Kirka Porta, a minor postern gate in the inner wall, was used by defenders to make sorties against besiegers. During the final assault, some defenders used this gate to attack Ottoman troops from an unexpected angle. After the sortie, the gate should have been secured from the inside, but in the confusion, noise, and darkness, someone forgot to bar the gate. It remained unlocked, slightly ajar. Ottoman soldiers, pressing against the walls, noticed the open gate. They pushed through. A small group entered the space between the inner and outer walls. They found themselves behind the main defences. They spread out, attacking defenders from behind. Panic began to spread. Byzantine soldiers, suddenly, finding enemies within the walls, struggled to understand what was happening. The breach was not large, but it created confusion at a critical moment. Meanwhile, another section of wall had been badly damaged by cannon fire. The Ottomans concentrated an assault there. Janissaries climbed over rubble, breaching the outer defences. Defenders fought desperately, but the combination of the open gate and the breach overwhelmed them. Ottoman troops poured into the city. The defence collapsed. Street fighting continued for hours, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Emperor Constantine XI died fighting. His body was never definitively identified. Lost among thousands of casualties, the Ottomans took the city. Soldiers looted for 3 days. As was customary, churches were plundered, citizens were killed or enslaved. The great city, capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years, fell. Mehmed entered Constantinople in triumph. He ordered the Hagia Sophia, the great Byzantine cathedral, converted into a mosque. The Byzantine Empire ceased to exist. The fall of Constantinople had profound consequences. Byzantine scholars fled west, bringing with them ancient Greek texts. This influx of knowledge contributed to the Italian Renaissance. The Ottoman Empire gained control of critical trade routes, prompting European nations to seek alternative routes to Asia. This search led to the Age of Exploration. Portuguese and Spanish expeditions sailed west and south, eventually reaching the Americas and circumnavigating the globe. The open gate at Kirka Porta was not the sole reason for Constantinople's fall. The city was doomed by overwhelming numerical and technological superiority. The Ottomans would likely have succeeded eventually. Yet the unlocked gate accelerated the collapse. It created confusion and panic at the decisive moment. A single gate, forgotten in the chaos of battle, allowed enemies to enter where they should not have been. The Byzantine Empire ended not with a heroic last stand, but with an unlocked door. Columbus miscalculates the planet. Christopher Columbus believed he could reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. This was not a new idea. Educated people in the 15th century knew the Earth was round. The question was not the Earth's shape, but its size. How far west would one need to sail to reach the Indies? The answer depended on the Earth's circumference. Columbus miscalculated. His error led him to discover a continent he did not know existed. Ancient Greek scholars had estimated the Earth's circumference with reasonable accuracy. Eratosthenes, in the 3rd century before the Common Era, calculated a figure remarkably close to modern measurements. By the 15th century, scholars used various estimates, but most were broadly consistent with reality. The Earth's circumference at the equator is approximately 40,000 kilometers, or roughly 25,000 miles. Columbus relied on different sources. He favored calculations by the ancient geographer Ptolemy and medieval Islamic scholar Al-Farghani. However, Columbus misinterpreted Al-Farghani's figures. Al-Farghani used Arabic miles, which are longer than Roman miles. Columbus assumed he meant Roman miles, which are shorter. This error made Columbus think the Earth was significantly smaller than it actually is. Columbus also adopted overly generous estimates for the size of Asia. He believed the Eurasian landmass extended further east than it does. Marco Polo's travel accounts, widely read in Europe, described vast riches in China and the Indies. Columbus accepted exaggerated estimates of how far east Asia extended. If Europe stretched from west to east, and Asia extended far to the west from its eastern edge, then the ocean between them must be narrow. Columbus calculated that the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan was approximately 2,400 nautical miles. In reality, the distance is over 10,000 nautical miles. His estimate was off by a factor of more than 4. No ship of his era could carry enough supplies to survive such a voyage. If the Atlantic had been as empty as Columbus believed, his expedition would have starved or died of thirst before reaching land. Columbus presented his plan to various European monarchs. Portugal's King John II consulted his experts. They rejected the proposal, correctly assessing that Columbus underestimated the distance. Spain's monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, also hesitated. Scholars at the Spanish court advised against the expedition, citing the same concerns. Columbus persisted. He lobbied for years. Eventually, after the Spanish conquered Granada in 1492, completing the Reconquista, Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to fund a modest expedition. 3 ships departed from Palos de la Frontera in August 1492, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña. The crews totaled approximately 90 men. They sailed south to the Canary Islands, then west into the Atlantic. Weeks passed. The crews grew anxious. The promised land did not appear. Provisions diminished. Crew members threatened mutiny. Columbus persuaded them to continue for a few more days. On October 12, 1492, a lookout on the Pinta spotted land. They had reached an island in the Bahamas. Columbus named it San Salvador. He believed he had reached islands off the coast of Asia, perhaps near Japan or the Indies. He explored the Caribbean, encountering indigenous peoples, whom he called Indians, believing them inhabitants of the Indies. He found gold in small quantities and exotic goods, reinforcing his belief that he was near Asia's wealthy kingdoms. Columbus never realized his error. He made 4 voyages to the Caribbean and South America's northern coast. He died in 1506, still believing he had reached Asia's outskirts. Other explorers soon realized the truth. Amerigo Vespucci, exploring south America's coast, recognized that this was a new continent, not Asia. Mapmakers began showing a separate landmass. Martin Waldseemüller's World Map of 1507 named the new continent America in Vespucci's honor. Columbus's miscalculation had enormous consequences. He discovered the Americas by accident, seeking a route to Asia and finding an unknown continent instead. The encounter initiated the Columbian Exchange, transferring plants, animals, diseases, and people between the Old World and the New. European colonization of the Americas followed, bringing wealth to Europe but catastrophe to indigenous populations. Diseases like smallpox killed millions who had no immunity. Entire civilizations collapsed. The world was transformed. If Columbus had calculated correctly, he would have known the voyage was impossible with available technology. He would not have attempted it. Spain would not have funded an expedition to sail 10,000 miles into the unknown. The Americas would have remained isolated from Europe longer. Eventually, other explorers would have found them. Portuguese expeditions sailing around Africa to reach Asia might have encountered South America. But the timing and nature of contact would have differed. Columbus's error put him in the right place at the right time to encounter a new world, changing history forever. The watch error at Gallipoli. The First World War ground into stalemate on the Western Front. Trenches stretched from the English Channel to Switzerland. Millions of men faced each other across no man's land. Attacks gained yards at the cost of thousands of lives. By 1915, strategists saw alternatives. The Gallipoli campaign represented an attempt to break the deadlock by opening a new front far from the western trenches. The plan was to force the Dardanelles Strait, the narrow passage connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara and ultimately the Black Sea. If Allied forces could seize the strait, they could threaten Constantinople, the Ottoman capital. This might knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. It would open a route to supply Russia through the Black Sea. It might persuade neutral Balkan states to join the Allies. The strategic potential was enormous. The naval assault in February and March 1915 failed. Mines and shore batteries sank or damaged several Allied warships. The Navy could not force the passage alone. Troops would be needed to capture the forts and clear the minefields. An amphibious landing was planned. British, Australian and New Zealand forces, along with French troops, would land on the Gallipoli Peninsula, seize the high ground and control the strait. The landing was set for April the 25th, 1915. Careful planning and coordination were essential. Naval bombardments would soften defences before troops went ashore. The landings would occur at multiple beaches simultaneously, spreading Ottoman defenders thin. Surprise and precise timing were critical advantages. The plan for the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, known as ANZAC, involved a landing on the western coast of the peninsula before dawn. They would move quickly inland, seizing ridges before Ottoman reinforcements arrived. Darkness would provide concealment. Speed would compensate for limited numbers. Everything depended on coordinated timing. British and Australian officers synchronized their watches before the operation began. Precise timing ensured naval bombardment would lift just as troops landed, giving defenders no time to recover. However, somewhere in the coordination process, an error occurred. Some officers' watches were not synchronized correctly. Accounts vary on the exact nature of the mistake. Some sources suggest watches were set to different time zones. Others indicate simple miscalculation. The result was confusion about the exact landing time. The naval bombardment began at a scheduled time. Guns from battleships and cruisers pounded the shoreline. Shells exploded inland, targeting suspected defensive positions. The bombardment was supposed to last until moments before troops landed. But due to the watch error, some naval units ceased fire too early, others continued too long. Troops in landing boats expected covering fire. Some received it, others found silence, indicating the bombardment had ended prematurely, exposing them as they approached the beach. The Anzac forces landed in darkness and confusion. Boats drifted off course due to strong currents. They came ashore at a location different from planned, a beach with steep cliffs rather than the intended gentler slopes. The terrain was more difficult to navigate. The disorder from the watch error compounded this problem. Units landed out of sequence. Coordination broke down. Officers struggled to organize men in the darkness on unfamiliar ground. Ottoman defenders, though initially surprised, recovered quickly. Turkish soldiers occupied high ground overlooking the beaches. They poured rifle and machine gun fire onto the Anzac troops struggling to advance inland. The attackers suffered heavy casualties. They managed to secure a foothold, but could not advance far. The element of surprise was partially lost. The precise coordination that might have enabled a breakthrough never materialized. At other landing sites, similar confusion occurred. British forces at Cape Helles faced fierce resistance. Some beaches saw massacres as troops were cut down before reaching the shore. The landings achieved their primary objective of putting troops ashore, but at terrible cost and without the rapid inland advance planners hoped for. The campaign quickly bogged down into trench warfare similar to the Western Front. The Gallipoli campaign lasted 8 months, both sides entrenched. Fighting was brutal. Disease, especially dysentery, ravaged troops. Summer heat and lack of water caused suffering. Winter brought freezing conditions. Casualties mounted. Approximately 44,000 Allied troops died. Ottoman casualties were similar or higher. The strategic objectives were never achieved. In December and January, Allied forces evacuated. The campaign was a costly failure. The watch error was not the sole reason for Gallipoli's failure. Poor planning, underestimation of Ottoman forces, difficult terrain, and logistical challenges all contributed. Yet the loss of coordination in the critical opening hours mattered. Amphibious landings are inherently risky. Success requires precise timing and overwhelming force at the point of attack. The watch error disrupted this. Units landed at the wrong times, in the wrong order. Naval support did not synchronize with troop movements. Confusion allowed defenders to react effectively. A small timing error had large consequences. The Lusitania's missed ZigZag. The Lusitania was one of the largest and fastest passenger liners of her era. Built by the Cunard Line, she entered service in 1907. The ship was luxurious, catering to wealthy passengers crossing the Atlantic between Britain and the United States. She could carry over 2,000 passengers and crew. Her speed, capable of over 25 knots, made her one of the fastest ships afloat. This speed was intended to provide safety as well as convenience. A fast ship could outrun threats, including submarines. By 1915, the First World War had entered its second year. Britain and Germany were locked in conflict. Germany declared the waters around the British Isles a war zone. German submarines, U-boats, would attack any ship, including neutral vessels, suspected of carrying contraband to Britain. This policy of unrestricted submarine warfare was controversial and dangerous. Neutral nations, particularly the United States, protested. Attacking civilian ships violated international norms. The Lusitania departed New York on May 1, 1915, bound for Liverpool. The ship carried nearly 2,000 passengers and crew. Many were Americans. The United States was neutral in the war. American citizens believed they had the right to travel safely on passenger ships. The German embassy published warnings in New York newspapers, advising passengers not to board ships bound for Britain. Most ignored these warnings. The ship also carried cargo. This included foodstuffs, medical supplies, and, though not publicly acknowledged at the time, munitions. Millions of rounds of rifle ammunition were in the cargo hold. This technically made the Lusitania a legitimate military target under the laws of war as interpreted by Germany. However, attacking a passenger liner without warning and without allowing passengers to evacuate was still considered barbaric. Captain William Turner commanded the Lusitania. He was an experienced officer. As the ship approached the Irish coast, the British Admiralty sent warnings about U-boat activity in the area. Several ships had been torpedoed recently. Turner received instructions to travel at high speed, to steer a zigzag course to make the ship harder to target, and to avoid headlands where submarines might lurk. Zigzagging was a standard defensive measure. A ship moving in a straight line at constant speed is easy for a submarine to target. The U-boat captain calculates the ship's course and speed, aims the torpedo to intercept, and fires. If the target zigzags, changing direction unpredictably, the calculation becomes much more difficult. The torpedo might miss. Even if the submarine tries to reposition and fire again, time is lost, and the opportunity might be gone. Captain Turner reduced speed as he approached the Irish coast. He wanted to time his arrival at the Liverpool bar for high tide to safely cross. He also discontinued zigzagging. The reasons for this decision are debated. Turner later claimed visibility was good, and he did not believe zigzagging was necessary. Some suggest he thought zigzagging might confuse his own navigation. Others argue he disregarded or misunderstood the Admiralty's instructions. On the morning of May 7th, the Lusitania was off the southern coast of Ireland. The weather was clear, visibility was excellent. Unknown to Turner, the German submarine U-20, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger, was in the area. Schwieger had orders to attack merchant shipping. He had already sunk several vessels on this patrol. He was running low on torpedoes and fuel. He planned to head home soon. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, Schwieger sighted the Lusitania. The large four-funnelled liner was unmistakable. She was travelling in a straight line at a steady, relatively slow speed. Schwieger manoeuvred the U-20 into position. The target's predictable course made the calculation simple. He fired a single torpedo from a range of about 700 metres. The torpedo struck the Lusitania on the starboard side, just behind the bridge. The explosion was massive. Moments later, a second, larger explosion occurred within the ship. The cause of this second explosion is debated. It might have been coal dust in the bunkers, or steam from ruptured boilers, or possibly the munitions in the cargo hold. Whatever the cause, the second explosion was catastrophic. The ship began listing immediately. Water poured in. The list grew rapidly, making it impossible to launch many lifeboats on the port side. Panic ensued. The Lusitania sank in 18 minutes. There was not enough time to organise an orderly evacuation. Lifeboats capsized. People jumped into the cold water. Of the nearly 2,000 aboard, approximately 1,200 died. Among the dead were 128 Americans. The loss shocked the world. Public opinion in the United States turned sharply against Germany. Calls for war grew louder. If Captain Turner had maintained the zigzag manoeuvre as instructed, would the Lusitania have survived? Possibly. Schwieger's torpedo shot might have missed. The submarine might not have been able to reposition for a second attempt before the Lusitania moved out of range. The ship's speed, if maintained at full or near full, combined with zigzagging, would have made targeting extremely difficult. The decision to travel in a straight line at reduced speed created an easy target. The sinking of the Lusitania did not immediately bring the United States into the war. President Woodrow Wilson maintained neutrality for nearly 2 more years. However, the incident poisoned German-American relations. It made German submarine warfare a potent propaganda tool for interventionists. When Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, the memory of the Lusitania helped push the United States into declaring war. American entry tipped the balance, ultimately leading to Germany's defeat. A missed zigzag manoeuvre. A captain's decision, whether from misjudgment, complacency, or misunderstanding, to sail straight and slow. That choice delivered his ship to an enemy submarine, resulting in mass casualties and consequences that rippled through the war's outcome. Caesar ignores a simple warning. Gaius Julius Caesar stood at the height of power in Rome. He had conquered Gaul, expanding Roman territory and wealth. He had crossed the Rubicon, defying the Senate, and won a civil war. He had defeated his rivals and emerged as dictator. By 44 before the Common Era, Caesar was the most powerful man in the Roman world. He held the title Dictator Perpetuus, Dictator in perpetuity. This lifetime appointment alarmed traditionalists who valued the Republic's checks and balances. Caesar implemented reforms. He reorganized the calendar, creating the Julian calendar that, with modifications, is still used today. He initiated building projects, granted citizenship to people in the provinces, and planned military campaigns against the Parthians. He was active, energetic, and ambitious. He also grew increasingly autocratic. He dismissed criticism, accepted honours that seemed monarchical, and allegedly considered taking the title of king. In Rome, kingship was anathema. The Republic had been founded by overthrowing kings 5 centuries earlier. A conspiracy formed. Approximately 60 senators and equestrians plotted to assassinate Caesar. They believed killing him would restore the Republic. The leaders included Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Some conspirators had been Caesar's allies or beneficiaries of his clemency after the Civil War. Their motives mixed genuine concern for the Republic with personal grievances and ambition. The conspirators planned to kill Caesar during a Senate meeting on the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month, in 44 before the Common Era. The meeting was scheduled at the theatre of Pompeii. Caesar would be alone, without his bodyguards, who were not permitted inside the Senate. The conspirators would surround him and strike with daggers. They planned every detail. Each conspirator knew his role. Secrecy was maintained despite the large number involved. Rumours circulated in Rome. Omens and warnings appeared. A soothsayer named Spurinna warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. Caesar dismissed this, considering it superstition. On the night before the Ides, Caesar attended a dinner party. Conversation turned to the best kind of death. Caesar said a sudden death was preferable. He did not know how soon he would get his wish. On the morning of the Ides of March, Caesar prepared to go to the Senate. His wife Calpurnia begged him not to go. She had dreamed of his murder the night before. She was frightened and pleaded with him to stay home or postpone the meeting. Caesar initially agreed, considering her fear and the various omens. However, one of the conspirators, Decimus Brutus, arrived at Caesar's house. He persuaded Caesar to attend, arguing that cancelling would insult the senators and encourage gossip. Caesar yielded and decided to go. As Caesar made his way to the theatre, a man named Artemidorus approached him. Artemidorus was a teacher of Greek rhetoric. He had learned of the conspiracy. He wrote a detailed message naming the conspirators and warning Caesar of the plot. He pushed through the crowd and handed the paper to Caesar, urging him to read it immediately. It was vital and urgent. Caesar took the paper. He held it in his hand. He began to read, or tried to, but people pressed around him, asking questions, seeking favours, presenting petitions. The crowd was dense. Noise and confusion surrounded him. Caesar attempted to read Artemidorus's message multiple times, but was constantly interrupted. He never read it fully. He entered the theatre of Pompeii still holding the unread warning. Once inside, the senators gathered. The conspirators moved into position. Caesar took his seat. Tullius Cimber approached, presenting a petition for his exiled brother's return. Caesar refused. Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga, pulling it down from his shoulders. This was the signal. The conspirators struck. Multiple daggers stabbed Caesar. He tried to defend himself, but was overwhelmed. According to tradition, he saw Marcus Brutus among the attackers and said, "You too, child," or perhaps the Greek phrase, "kai su teknon." He stopped resisting and fell at the base of Pompeii's statue. He was stabbed 23 times. He died within moments. The paper from Artemidorus was found on Caesar's body. It had never been read. It contained the names of the conspirators and details of the plot. If Caesar had read it, he would have known who planned to kill him. He could have arrested them, postponed the meeting, or simply not attended. His life could have been saved. The assassination did not restore the Republic as the conspirators hoped. Instead, it triggered another civil war. Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant, turned public opinion against the assassins. Caesar's will revealed he left money to Roman citizens and opened his gardens for public use. People were enraged at his murder. Brutus and Cassius fled Rome. Eventually they were defeated. Most conspirators died violent deaths. Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, later known as Augustus, emerged victorious from the civil wars. He became the first Roman emperor, establishing the principate that ended the Republic. The conspirators' goal of preserving the Republic was utterly defeated. By killing Caesar, they destroyed what they sought to save. If Caesar had survived, he might have continued as dictator, but the Republic might have lingered in some form. His death guaranteed its end, an unread warning. A piece of paper clutched in Caesar's hand as he walked to his death. The information was there, the means to save himself, but the noise of crowds, the press of petitioners, the trivial interruptions of daily life prevented him from seeing the danger. That simple failure to read a note changed everything. Pompeii's lookout falls asleep. Mount Vesuvius stood above the Bay of Naples in southern Italy. The mountain was dormant, as it had been for centuries. The people living around its slopes considered it just a mountain, fertile and safe. Vineyards and farms covered the lower slopes. Towns and cities thrived. Pompeii, a prosperous city of perhaps 15,000 people, sat several kilometers from the mountain. Herculaneum lay closer, directly at the base. Both cities enjoyed wealth from agriculture, trade, and the fertile volcanic soil. In the years before 79 of the Common Era, minor earthquakes shook the region. In 63, a major earthquake damaged Pompeii and other towns. Buildings collapsed, repairs took years. Residents grew accustomed to tremors. They were common in the area. No one connected them specifically to Vesuvius. The concept of volcanic activity was not well understood in the Roman world. Mountains sometimes emitted smoke or fire, but people did not grasp the catastrophic potential. On the morning of August the 24th, 79, unusual activity began on Vesuvius. Witnesses later described a column of smoke rising from the summit. It grew throughout the morning, climbing high into the sky. The column resembled a pine tree, with a tall trunk and spreading branches at the top. This was unusual, but not immediately terrifying. People watched, uncertain what it meant. Pompeii had watchmen and lookouts, as all cities did. Their duties included watching for fires, signalling time, and observing approaching threats. On a normal day, they would notice any unusual activity and alert authorities. But on this day, accounts suggest that a lookout stationed to watch the mountain may have been asleep or inattentive during the crucial early signs. This detail comes from fragmented historical sources and is not definitively confirmed. However, the delayed response of Pompeii's population to the eruption suggests warnings were not given promptly. The eruption intensified rapidly. By early afternoon, the column of ash and pumice towered kilometers into the sky. The wind blew toward Pompeii. Ash began falling on the city. Small pumice stones rained down, light and porous, accumulating on roofs. People initially stayed indoors, thinking the ashfall would pass. As hours went by and the ash continued, accumulation reached dangerous levels. Roofs began collapsing under the weight. By evening, Pompeii was in darkness, the ash cloud blocked the sun. Pumice accumulated to several meters deep in some areas. Buildings collapsed, breathing became difficult. Ash filled the air, some people fled. They ran toward the sea or along roads leading away from the mountain. Others stayed in their homes, hiding in cellars or back rooms, hoping the disaster would end. They made a fatal choice. Late that night and into the next day, the nature of the eruption changed. Pyroclastic surges, fast-moving flows of superheated gas and volcanic debris raced down the mountain. These surges traveled at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Temperatures reached 500 degrees Celsius or more. Nothing could survive. The first surge reached Herculaneum, killing everyone who remained. Subsequent surges reached Pompeii. People who had survived the ashfall died instantly from the heat. Their bodies were buried under meters of ash and pumice. The eruption ended after 2 days. Vesuvius was changed. The summit had collapsed, creating a caldera. The landscape was unrecognizable. Pompeii and Herculaneum were buried. The cities disappeared under volcanic deposits. Survivors did not return. The area was abandoned. Over time, vegetation grew. The buried cities were forgotten. Centuries passed before they were rediscovered in the 18th century. Could people have been saved with earlier warning? Possibly. The eruption's early phase, the rising column of smoke and initial ash fall, provided hours of potential warning. If lookouts or officials had recognized the danger immediately and ordered evacuation, many could have fled before the situation became deadly. The problem was lack of understanding. No one in Pompeii had experienced a volcanic eruption. They did not know what was happening or how dangerous it would become. The detail of a sleeping lookout, whether literal or symbolic, represents the failure to recognize danger. The warning signs were there. The mountain was clearly active, smoke and ash were visible, but without knowledge of what these signs meant, people did not react appropriately. They delayed, they hesitated, they hoped the situation would improve. By the time the danger was undeniable, escape was impossible. The destruction of Pompeii was not inevitable. If the population had evacuated when the eruption began, most could have survived. The initial ashfall, while disruptive, was not immediately lethal. People had time. They lacked only the knowledge and prompting to use that time wisely. A sleeping lookout, a failure to sound an alarm, a missing warning that could have saved thousands. The buried city stands as a monument to the cost of unrecognized danger. The messenger who took the wrong road. In ancient Greece, city-states were frequently at war or on the verge of war. Diplomacy was conducted through messengers carrying written or oral communications. These messengers travelled on foot or horseback, through mountainous terrain, along rough roads, sometimes through hostile territory. Speed and accuracy were essential. A message arriving late or to the wrong destination could mean the difference between peace and war. In the 5th century before the Common Era, tensions escalated between Athens and a rival state. The exact identity of the rival state is lost to historical vagueness, though some accounts suggest it was a smaller city-state in the Peloponnese. Athens had sent an ultimatum. The rival had responded with a counter-proposal. Negotiations were delicate. Both sides wanted to avoid war if possible, but both were prepared to fight if necessary. Athens sent a final message, a treaty proposal, generous in some ways, firm in others. The message was entrusted to a single messenger, a young man known for his speed and reliability. He was instructed to travel to the rival city, deliver the message to the council, and await a response. Time was of the essence. If the rival accepted, peace would be preserved. If they rejected or delayed, Athens would mobilize for war. The messenger departed Athens in the morning. He travelled south. The route was well known, a main road leading through the countryside toward the Peloponnese. However, at a certain point, the road forked. One branch continued toward the rival city. The other led to a different destination, a town allied with Athens, but not involved in the current negotiations. The messenger, travelling quickly, reached the fork. The roads were poorly marked. Signposts were rare in ancient Greece. Travellers relied on knowledge of routes or asking locals for directions. The messenger was confident. He had travelled this way before, or so he believed. He chose the left fork without hesitation. It was the wrong road. The left fork led away from the rival city. The messenger travelled for hours before realising his error. By then, he was far off course. The sun was setting. He had no choice but to find a place to stay for the night and correct his course in the morning. He found a village, slept uneasily, and at dawn retraced his steps. The delay cost a full day. Meanwhile, in the rival city, the council waited for Athens' response. Hours passed. A day went by. No messenger arrived. The council interpreted this silence as rejection or contempt. Athens had sent an ultimatum, they reasoned, and now refused to negotiate further. The rival cities' leaders, insulted and anxious, decided to act preemptively. They mobilized their army and prepared to strike first. When the messenger finally arrived, a day and a half late, he found the city preparing for war. He delivered the message, but it was too late. The council read the treaty proposal. It was acceptable. They would have agreed, but now their own forces were mobilized. Pride and momentum carried them forward. War began. The conflict was brief but costly. Both sides suffered casualties. Eventually, mediation by a neutral city-state arranged a peace, similar in terms to what the original treaty proposed. The war had been unnecessary. If the message had arrived on time, it would have been avoided. The messenger's error was simple. He took the wrong fork at a junction. Perhaps the roads were confusing, perhaps he was tired or overconfident, perhaps a signpost was missing or damaged. The reason does not matter. The result was delay, and the delay led to misunderstanding, and the misunderstanding led to war. Lives were lost because a messenger chose the wrong road. A slave drops a torch in Rome. Rome in the 1st century of the Common Era was a city of over 1 million people. Buildings crowded together. Most residents lived in multi-story insulae, apartment blocks constructed cheaply with wood and mud brick. The streets were narrow. Fire was an ever-present danger. Cooking fires, oil lamps, and torches provided light and heat. Water sources were limited. Fire brigades existed, but their equipment and effectiveness were rudimentary. A small fire could spread rapidly, becoming an inferno. In July of the year 64, during the reign of Emperor Nero, a fire broke out in Rome. The Great Fire of Rome burned for 6 days and destroyed much of the city. Ancient sources provide conflicting accounts of how it started. Some blame Nero himself, suggesting he ordered the fire to clear space for his ambitious building projects. Others suggest it was an accident. One account, less well known but persistent in some sources, attributes the initial spark to a slave. The story goes that a slave working in a shop near the Circus Maximus was carrying a torch to light a lamp or start a fire for cooking. Torches were common. They consisted of wood or reeds soaked in pitch or resin. They burned with open flames and were carried through streets and buildings routinely. This particular slave was hurrying, perhaps to complete a task before his master returned. He stumbled. The torch fell from his hand. It landed in a pile of dry goods, cloth or straw stored in or near the shop. The materials ignited immediately. Flames spread to the wooden structures of the shop. The slave tried to extinguish the fire. He failed. The flames grew quickly. Neighbouring shops caught fire. Within minutes, a full block was burning. The fire occurred at night. Residents were asleep. By the time alarms were raised, the fire had spread too far to control. The Circus Maximus, where the fire began, was surrounded by shops and wooden structures. The area was densely packed. Wind carried embers to other buildings. The fire jumped streets. It spread in multiple directions. Fire brigades, known as Mawai Vigiles, responded but were overwhelmed. Water supplies were insufficient. The fire raged. Emperor Nero was at Antium, a coastal town, when the fire started. He returned to Rome quickly. He organised relief efforts, opened public buildings to house refugees, and arranged food supplies. Despite these efforts, much of Rome burned. 10 of the city's 14 districts were affected. 3 were completely destroyed. Thousands of people lost their homes. Casualties, while not precisely recorded, were significant. Nero faced accusations of starting the fire himself. Rumours spread that he had watched the fire and sung about the burning of Troy. These accusations were likely politically motivated. Nero's enemies used the fire to attack his reputation. To deflect blame, Nero accused Christians, a small and unpopular sect, of arson. He initiated persecutions. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed. This marked one of the first major persecutions of Christians in Roman history. The fire's aftermath transformed Rome. Nero used the cleared land to build his Domus Aurea, the Golden House, an enormous palace complex. He also implemented new building codes. Buildings were required to have more stone and less wood, streets were widened, fire safety improved, Rome rebuilt, becoming grander and more organised than before. The story of the slave and the drop torch is not definitively proven. Ancient sources are inconsistent. However, it persists as one possible origin of the fire. Whether the fire started with a drop torch, a cooking accident, arson, or some other cause, the result was the same. A small initial spark led to one of the ancient world's most destructive urban fires. Rome was changed forever. The political consequences, including the persecution of Christians, rippled through history. A translation mistake gives Moses horns. The Hebrew Bible contains many ancient texts, written originally in Hebrew and Aramaic. When these texts were translated into other languages, translators faced challenges. Hebrew is a complex language. Words can have multiple meanings. Context determines which meaning is correct. Translators' choices shaped how subsequent cultures understood biblical narratives and figures. One of the most significant translation errors involves Moses. In the book of Exodus, Moses descends from Mount Sinai after receiving the Ten Commandments. He has been in God's presence. The Hebrew text describes Moses' face as having karan. This Hebrew word can mean to shine or to send forth beams of light. It can also mean to have horns. The root word keren means horn, as in an animal's horn, but also a ray of light or a beam. When St. Jerome translated the Hebrew Bible into Latin in the late 4th and early 5th centuries of the Common Era, creating the Vulgate, he chose to translate karan as horned. The Latin phrase he used was cornuta esset facies sua, meaning his face was horned. This choice may have been influenced by the fact that horn and ray are related concepts in Hebrew. Rays of light can be described metaphorically as horns. Jerome may have interpreted the text literally rather than metaphorically. Jerome's translation became the standard Bible for the Western Christian Church for over 1,000 years. Scholars, artists, and common people relied on the Vulgate. When they read about Moses, they read that his face was horned. This created a widespread belief that Moses literally had horns protruding from his forehead. Artistic depictions followed this interpretation. Michelangelo, one of history's greatest artists, sculpted a statue of Moses in the early 16th century. The statue was commissioned for the tomb of Pope Julius II in Rome. Michelangelo's Moses is powerful, seated, holding the tablets of the law. On his head are two prominent horns. They protrude from his forehead, small but unmistakable. Michelangelo based this on the Vulgate's description. He followed the prevailing understanding of the text. The sculpture became one of Michelangelo's most famous works. It remains in the church of San Pietro, in Vincoli in Rome, viewed by countless visitors. The horned Moses became iconic. Other artists followed this tradition. Medieval and Renaissance art frequently depicted Moses with horns. Illustrations in manuscripts, carvings in churches, paintings, all showed Moses this way. The error persisted because Latin remained the language of scholarship and the church. Few questioned Jerome's translation. The Vulgate was authoritative. Only with the Renaissance and the rise of humanist scholarship did scholars begin re-examining original Hebrew texts. They recognized the translation error. Quran should have been translated as shining or radiant, not horned. Moses' face glowed with divine light after his encounter with God. It did not grow horns. The Protestant Reformation brought new translations. Martin Luther's German Bible, the King James Version in English, and other translations corrected the error. They described Moses' face as shining, but the horned image persisted in art and popular imagination. Michelangelo's statue was not altered, it remained horned. Art inspired by the Vulgate remained unchanged. The consequences of this translation error were primarily cultural and theological. It shaped how Moses was visualized for over a millennium. It created confusion and sometimes contributed to anti-Semitic imagery. Horns were associated with devils and demons in medieval Christian iconography. Depicting Moses with horns, even if unintentional, could be used to cast Jewish figures in negative light. This was not Jerome's intent, but the imagery had unfortunate effects. The correction of the error took centuries to fully propagate. Even today, many people are surprised to learn that the horns on Michelangelo's Moses are based on a mistranslation. The statue is famous, reproduced in art books and studied by scholars. The horns are a permanent part of one of art. History's masterpieces, a lasting consequence of a linguistic error made 1600 years ago. A scribe misplaces a decimal in China. Imperial China relied on detailed record-keeping. Bureaucracy permeated the empire. Scribes recorded taxes, grain production, population figures, and countless other data points. These records informed policy decisions. Emperors and officials used them to allocate resources, plan infrastructure, and assess the empire's health. Accuracy was essential. Errors in records could lead to poor decisions, unjust taxation, and social unrest. During the Tang dynasty, approximately in the 8th century of the Common Era, a scribe in a provincial office was tasked with recording the annual grain tax collection for his district. The numbers were large, thousands of bushels of grain collected from numerous villages. The scribe used the traditional Chinese numeral system. He wrote the figures carefully, column by column. However, in one entry, he made an error. He misplaced a character, effectively shifting the decimal point, or rather, the equivalent in the Chinese numeral system. The error inflated the recorded tax collection by a factor of 10. Instead of recording 1,000 bushels collected, the document stated 10,000 bushels. The scribe did not notice the mistake. His supervisor did not catch it during review. The report was submitted to the provincial capital. It was compiled with reports from other districts. The aggregate figures were sent to the imperial capital, Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an. At the central government level, officials reviewed tax collection figures. They noticed that one province reported significantly higher grain collection than expected. This was surprising but not alarming. Perhaps the harvest had been exceptionally good, perhaps local officials were particularly efficient. The inflated figures were accepted as accurate. Based on these figures, the central government adjusted tax quotas for the following year. If the province could collect this much grain, surely it could maintain or even increase that level. The next year's tax quota was set higher. Officials in the province received the new quota and were confused. They had not collected as much grain as the central government believed. Meeting the new quota would be impossible without drastically increasing burdens on farmers. Local officials faced a dilemma. They could report the error, admitting the previous year's figures were wrong. This would bring shame and possibly punishment. Bureaucratic errors were not taken lightly. Alternatively, they could attempt to meet the quota, extracting more grain from an already strained population. They chose the latter. Tax collectors increased their demands. Farmers were required to surrender more grain. Those who could not pay faced penalties, confiscation of property, or forced labour. The increased burden caused hardship. Families went hungry. Resentment grew. In some villages, protests erupted. Minor officials tried to suppress unrest, but tensions simmered. The situation escalated. A particularly harsh harvest the following year compounded the problem. Farmers had less grain to begin with. The high tax quota was even more impossible to meet. Starvation became a reality in some areas. Desperation led to violence. A local uprising began. Farmers attacked tax collectors and government granaries. What started as isolated incidents spread to neighbouring districts. The provincial governor mobilised troops to suppress the rebellion. Fighting occurred. Lives were lost on both sides. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but not without significant cost. The central government investigated. They discovered the original error, the misplaced decimal in the tax records. The inflated figure had caused the entire chain of events. The scribe who made the error had long since moved to another position, or died. Accountability was difficult to assign. The system itself was at fault, relying on human copying without sufficient checks. Reforms were proposed, double entry systems, more rigorous audits. Some changes were implemented, though bureaucracy resists change. The consequences of one scribe's error rippled outward. An incorrect number led to unrealistic policies. Those policies led to oppression. Oppression led to revolt. Lives were lost. Trust in government was eroded. All because a character was written in the wrong column, a decimal misplaced, a simple error that no one caught until it was too late. A Viking falls asleep on watch. The Viking Age, spanning roughly from the late 8th to the late 11th centuries, was marked by Norse expansion across Europe. Vikings raided, traded, and settled in lands from the British Isles to the Mediterranean. Their success depended on surprise, speed, and ferocity. A small band of Vikings could overwhelm a larger force if they struck unexpectedly. Conversely, if defenders had warning, Vikings faced significant danger. Vigilance was crucial. In the late 9th century, a Viking warband set up a temporary camp on the coast of England. They had raided several monasteries and villages, accumulating plunder. Their ships were drawn up on the beach, the warriors rested, planning to sail home with the next favourable wind. The local Anglo-Saxon lord knew of their presence. He gathered his forces, planning a counterattack to recover stolen goods and drive the invaders away. The Vikings, experienced warriors, knew they were in hostile territory. They posted guards around the camp perimeter. Each guard had a shift, watching for approaching enemies. Discipline was essential. A guard falling asleep could mean death for everyone. The guard rotation was organised, with warriors taking turns throughout the night. One particular night, a young warrior was assigned the watch from midnight until dawn. He had been with the warband for 2 seasons. He was eager to prove himself, though he was not yet a seasoned veteran. The night was quiet. Hours passed without incident. The rhythmic sound of waves, the rustling of wind through trees, the darkness, all created a lulling atmosphere. The young warrior's eyelids grew heavy. He fought sleep. He walked back and forth, trying to stay alert. But exhaustion overcame him. He sat down, thinking he would rest for just a moment. He closed his eyes. Within minutes, he was asleep. The camp lay unguarded on his section of the perimeter. The Anglo-Saxon lord and his men approached in the darkness. They moved quietly, knowing surprise was essential. They expected the Vikings to have guards posted. Their plan was to overwhelm the guards quickly and then attack the sleeping camp. As they neared, scouts advanced cautiously. They spotted the camp. They looked for guards. They saw the young warrior slumped against a tree, asleep. The Anglo-Saxons could hardly believe their luck. They crept past the sleeping guard. They positioned themselves around the camp. At a signal, they attacked. Shouting war cries, they rushed in. The sleeping Vikings woke to chaos. Men grabbed weapons, tried to organize a defense, but they were caught unprepared. Some were killed in their blankets. Others fought desperately, half-dressed and disoriented. The battle was brutal and short. The Vikings, despite their reputation as fierce warriors, were at a severe disadvantage. Many died. Others fled into the darkness, abandoning their plunder and ships. The Anglo-Saxons achieved a decisive victory. They recovered stolen goods, burned the Viking ships, and sent the survivors fleeing into the countryside. The warband was destroyed. The young warrior who fell asleep was among the dead. Whether he was killed in the initial assault or died later in the fighting is not recorded. His failure cost not only his own life, but the lives of his companions. The warband's defeat had strategic consequences. The local Anglo-Saxon lord's success emboldened other English lords. Resistance to Viking incursions stiffened. The balance of power in that region shifted. Areas that had been vulnerable to raiding became more secure. The incident illustrates how a single lapse can have disproportionate consequences. The young warrior did not intend to betray his comrades. He was simply tired. Sleep overtook him, but in war, intentions do not matter. Results do. His sleep allowed enemies to approach undetected. The entire warband paid the price. The wrong animal sacrifice in Carthage. Carthage was a powerful city-state on the North African coast in modern-day Tunisia. Founded by Phoenician colonists, Carthage became a dominant maritime and commercial power in the Western Mediterranean. By the 3rd century before the Common Era, Carthage controlled territories in North Africa, Iberia, Sicily, and Sardinia. The city rivaled Rome. The two powers clashed in a series of conflicts known as the Punic Wars. Religion was central to Carthaginian life. The city's patron deities included Baal-Hamon and Tanit. Sacrifices and rituals were performed to secure divine favour, especially before military campaigns. Priests interpreted omens and signs. A favourable omen encouraged action, an unfavourable omen counselled caution. Leaders took these signs seriously. Religious approval was necessary for major decisions. Before a significant military campaign during the Second Punic War, approximately in the late 3rd century before the Common Era, Carthaginian leaders consulted the priests. They sought to perform a sacrifice to Baal-Hamon, asking for divine blessing on the coming campaign. The ritual required specific procedures. The animal sacrificed had to be of a certain type and quality. Prayers had to be spoken correctly. Any deviation could anger the gods. The priests prepared the ceremony. A bull was chosen for sacrifice. Bulls were valuable, signifying the seriousness of the request. The animal was led to the altar. The priest began the ritual. However, at a critical moment there was confusion. Accounts suggest that a different animal, perhaps a goat or a ram, was brought forward instead of the intended bull. The error might have occurred due to miscommunication, a handler's mistake, or simple confusion in the bustle of preparation. The wrong animal was sacrificed. The priests realized the error immediately after the act was completed. They were horrified. This was a grave offense. The gods would not accept an improper sacrifice. Worse, offering the wrong animal might anger the deities, bringing misfortune rather than blessing. The priests consulted among themselves. They debated whether to repeat the sacrifice correctly. Some argued that the damage was done. Others insisted on correcting the mistake. Before a decision was reached, word of the error spread. Soldiers and officers learned that the sacrifice had gone wrong. In an era when people believed deeply in divine intervention, this news was catastrophic. Morale plummeted. The gods were offended. The campaign was cursed. Soldiers muttered among themselves. Fear and doubt spread through the ranks. The military commanders tried to reassure the troops. They ordered a new sacrifice, performed correctly. A bull was sacrificed. The proper prayers were spoken. The priest declared the ritual successful. But the damage to morale was not easily undone. Soldiers remained anxious. They entered the campaign with the belief that they were unlucky, that the gods were not with them. The campaign proceeded. Carthaginian forces engaged Roman legions. The battles were hard fought. At critical moments, when courage and determination were most needed, the Carthaginian soldiers wavered. They remembered the failed sacrifice. They believed divine favour was absent. This belief became self-fulfilling. Troops hesitated. Commanders' orders were followed reluctantly. Opportunities were missed. The Romans, sensing their opponents' uncertainty, pressed their advantage. The campaign ended in Carthaginian defeat. Territory was lost, resources were expended, the strategic position weakened. The failure had multiple causes: Roman military skill, logistical advantages, leadership decisions all played roles, but the psychological impact of the botched sacrifice contributed. Morale is intangible but vital. An army that believes it is doomed fights differently than an army confident in divine favour. The consequences rippled through the Second Punic War. Carthage's resources were finite. Each defeat made eventual victory less likely. Rome's confidence grew with each success. The war's outcome, Carthage's ultimate defeat and near destruction, cannot be attributed to a single event. Yet every setback mattered. The wrong animal sacrifice, a mistake in ritual procedure, weakened Carthage at a moment when strength was essential. The wrong beacon lit in Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire, successor to the Eastern Roman Empire, controlled territories around the Eastern Mediterranean for over 1,000 years. Communication across such vast distances was challenging. Important messages had to travel quickly. Beacons, fires lit on hilltops, provided a rapid communication system. A chain of beacons stretched across the empire. When one was lit, the next station would see it and light their beacon, passing the signal onward. Messages could travel hundreds of kilometers in hours. Beacons were used to signal emergencies. An enemy invasion, a revolt, a natural disaster, these required immediate military response. The system was carefully organized. Each beacon station had a designated meaning. Some signals indicated attacks from specific directions. Others called for mobilization of troops. Miscommunication could be catastrophic. Lighting the wrong beacon could send troops to the wrong location or create unnecessary panic. In the 10th century, during the reign of one of the Byzantine emperors, a beacon station in Anatolia was manned by soldiers. Their duty was to watch for signals from the east and relay them westward. One night, the soldiers on duty saw a fire on the eastern horizon. It appeared to be the beacon signal indicating an enemy invasion from Persia or the Arab caliphates. This was a dire threat. The soldiers immediately lit their beacon to relay the warning. The next station saw the fire and lit their beacon. The signal passed westward, station by station, until it reached the capital. Officials received the warning. An enemy invasion was underway. The emperor was informed. He ordered mobilization. Troops were summoned from garrisons across the western provinces. Supply trains were organized. The military machine of the Byzantine Empire lurched into motion. Thousands of soldiers marched eastward. Logistics were complex and expensive. Feeding and moving such a force required requisition in food from local populations, diverting resources from other needs. Civilians were affected, farms were stripped of supplies, markets were disrupted. The mobilization created hardship across the affected regions. After days of marching, the troops reached the eastern provinces. They prepared for battle. Scouts were sent ahead to locate the enemy, but no enemy was found. There was no invasion. Confusion reigned. Commanders questioned local officials. Messengers rode back to the capital seeking clarification. What had happened? Investigation revealed the error. The original fire that triggered the beacon chain was not an official signal. It was a campfire, or possibly a brush fire, that soldiers at the first beacon station mistook for the signal beacon from the east. In the darkness, from a distance, they could not distinguish between a signal fire and an ordinary fire. They assumed the worst and reacted accordingly. The mobilization was called off. Troops returned to their garrisons. The emperor was furious. Resources had been wasted. The population had been burdened unnecessarily. Worse, the false alarm exposed weaknesses in the beacon system. If false signals could trigger mobilization, the system was unreliable. Enemies could exploit this. They could light fires to trick the Byzantines into wasteful mobilizations, exhausting resources without fighting a battle. Reforms were discussed, more rigorous protocols for confirming signals, better training for beacon station soldiers, redundant systems to verify messages. Some changes were implemented, though bureaucracy and tradition resisted rapid alteration. The immediate consequences were financial and logistical strain. The long-term consequence was reduced confidence in the communication system. Officials became more cautious, perhaps too cautious, in responding to signals. This caution could delay genuine responses to real threats. The error, a soldier mistaking an ordinary fire for a signal beacon, cascaded through the system. One false signal triggered a chain reaction. Thousands of soldiers moved, resources were consumed, the empire's readiness was tested and found wanting. The incident highlighted the fragility of communication systems and the potential for small errors to create large disruptions. A farmer misbuilds a dam in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is often called the cradle of civilization. Irrigation was essential in this region. Seasonal floods brought water, but also destruction. Farmers built canals, levees, and dams to control water flow. A well-maintained irrigation system allowed fields to flourish even in the hot, dry climate. A failure in the system could bring disaster. In the early second millennium before the Common Era, during the time when city-states like Uruk, and Babylon competed for dominance, a farmer in a small village was tasked with repairing a section of a dam that controlled water flow to his community's fields. The dam was earthen, constructed from packed mud and clay. It required constant maintenance. Erosion, animal burrows, and weather damage weakened structures over time. Regular repairs were necessary. The farmer was experienced in fieldwork, but not a specialist in dam construction. Specialists existed, travelling from village to village, overseeing larger projects. But for routine maintenance, local farmers did the work themselves. The farmer inspected the dam. He saw a section where water had eroded the base. He decided to rebuild that section. He gathered clay and reeds. He worked for several days, packing earth, reinforcing the structure. However, he made a critical error. He did not adequately compact the soil. The new section was less dense than the original construction. He also misjudged the angle of the slope. The dam's face needed to be stable enough to resist water pressure. His repair was too steep, creating a weak point. The farmer finished the work. It looked solid. He was satisfied and returned to his regular farming duties. Weeks passed. The seasonal rains began. Water levels in the canal rose. The dam held initially, but as water continued to accumulate, pressure increased. The weak section the farmer had repaired began to fail. Water seeped through. The seepage eroded the soil from within. The weak section suddenly gave way. A breach opened. Water poured through the gap. The breach widened rapidly. Thousands of litres of water flooded into areas not meant to receive it. Fields were inundated. Crops were destroyed. The water carved new channels, eroding more land. Houses in the village's low-lying areas were flooded. Families evacuated, grabbing what possessions they could. The village's stored grain, kept in communal granaries, was at risk. Some granaries flooded, ruining the food supplies meant to last until the next harvest. Efforts to repair the breach failed. The water flow was too strong. Villagers tried to pile earth and rocks, but the current swept their efforts away. The flooding continued until the water level upstream dropped naturally after days. By then, the damage was extensive. Fields that should have been irrigated were dry. Fields that should have been dry were waterlogged. The crops for that season were largely lost. The village faced famine. Without sufficient food stores and with fields ruined, hunger became a reality. The village appealed to nearby communities for aid. Some help arrived, but resources were limited everywhere. Starvation forced some villagers to leave, seeking work or charity in other regions. The village's population declined. It never fully recovered. Archaeological evidence suggests that the village was eventually abandoned, its inhabitants dispersed into other settlements. The farmer who made the faulty repair was not malicious. He did his best with the knowledge and skills he had, but his error had consequences beyond his imagination. A poorly compacted dam section, a miscalculated slope. These small mistakes led to a catastrophic failure. The community suffered, livelihoods were destroyed. The incident likely became a cautionary tale, passed down, teaching the importance of proper construction techniques and the dangers of cutting corners in essential infrastructure. A single vote, Exiles, Arístides. Ancient Athens practiced a form of democracy unique in the ancient world. Citizens, meaning adult male Athenians, could participate directly in decision-making. The assembly met regularly to debate and vote on laws, policies, and leadership. One peculiar democratic practice was ostracism. Once a year, the assembly could vote to exile a citizen for 10 years. The purpose was to protect the state from individuals who might become too powerful or threaten democracy. A citizen had to receive at least 6,000 votes to be ostracized. Arístides was an Athenian statesman and general in the early 5th century before the Common Era. He was known for his integrity and fairness. He earned the nickname Arístides the Just. He served Athens well in various capacities. However, political rivalries existed. Themistocles, another prominent Athenian leader, saw Arístides as an obstacle. Themistocles favoured building a strong navy to counter the Persian threat. Arístides was more conservative, supporting traditional land-based military power. In the year 483 before the Common Era, an ostracism vote was held. Arístides was a candidate for exile. The procedure involves citizens writing a name on a piece of pottery, called an ostrakon. Each citizen voted for the person they wanted exiled. If one person received enough votes, they were banished for 10 years, though they retained their property and citizenship. The vote occurred. Citizens inscribed names on pottery shards and placed them in urns. The counting began. Arístides received many votes. The tally was close. He was approaching the 6,000 threshold required for exile. When the counting finished, Arístides had received 6,001 votes. He was ostracized, 1 vote over the minimum. 1 vote made the difference between staying and exile. Legend records an anecdote. An illiterate citizen, not recognizing Arístides, approached him during the vote. The citizen asked Arístides to write a name on the pottery shard for him. Arístides asked whose name. The citizen said Arístides. Arístides asked why. The citizen replied that he was tired of hearing everyone call Arístides the Just. Arístides, without revealing his identity, wrote his own name on the shard and handed it back. This story illustrates the pettiness that could influence democratic decisions. Arístides went into exile. He left Athens and lived in Aegina for several years. His absence removed a voice of experience and integrity from Athenian politics. Themistocles used this time to push through his naval policies. Athens built a large fleet of triremes. This fleet became crucial when Persia invaded Greece just a few years later. In 480, the Persians returned under King Xerxes. Greece faced existential danger. Athens recalled Arístides from exile, early recognizing his talents were needed. He returned and served with distinction. He commanded troops at the Battle of Plataea, contributing to the Greek victory that ended the Persian invasion. His exile had been temporary, but it removed him from influence during a critical period. The single vote that exiled Arístides mattered. If one person had voted differently, or if one vote had been counted incorrectly, Arístides would have remained. His presence might have altered the political dynamics leading up to the Persian Wars. Perhaps the naval build-up would have been delayed or reduced. Perhaps Athens would have been less prepared for the naval engagement at Salamis, which was decisive in defeating the Persians. Alternatively, Arístides' conservative caution might have led Athens to focus more on land defence, which could have been disastrous against the Persian navy. We cannot know the counterfactual. History does not reveal what might have been. But we know that one vote made the difference between exile and staying. One citizen's decision, whether informed, petty, or random, tipped the balance. Arístides left Athens. The city's trajectory changed. A single vote, a single pottery shard, and history pivoted. The wrong signal at Hastings. In October 1066, 2 armies faced each other near Hastings in southern England. Duke William of Normandy led an invasion force that had crossed the English Channel. King Harold Godwinson led the English defenders. The battle that followed determined England's future. The English fought on foot, forming a shield wall on a hillside. The Normans had cavalry and archers. The English position was strong. Norman cavalry charges broke against the shield wall repeatedly. The battle lasted hours with heavy casualties on both sides. The Normans employed a tactic called the feigned retreat. Cavalry would charge, engage briefly, then turn and flee as if routed. The goal was to lure English soldiers out of their defensive formation. If the English broke ranks to pursue, Norman cavalry could wheel around and attack the disorganized pursuers. The tactic required discipline and precise timing. The cavalry had to pretend to flee convincingly but remain organized enough to turn and attack on command. During the battle, Norman cavalry executed a feigned retreat. They charged up the hill, fought briefly, then turned and rode down the slope as if fleeing. The maneuver looked convincing. Some English soldiers, believing the Normans were genuinely routed, broke formation and pursued. This was exactly what William wanted. Once the English were scattered and off the hill, Norman cavalry wheeled around and cut them down. However, at one point, a feigned retreat went wrong. The signal to retreat was given, possibly by a horn or a shouted command. The cavalry turned and rode away. But the signal was misunderstood or the timing was off. Some sections of cavalry genuinely believed the retreat was real. They thought the battle was lost. They fled in earnest, not as a tactic, but in panic. This genuine flight spread confusion through Norman ranks. Other units, seeing their comrades flee, assumed disaster and began retreating as well. What started as a tactical maneuver turned into a rout. The Norman army teetered on the edge of collapse. English soldiers, seeing the Normans flee, shouted in triumph. Some pursued, thinking victory was at hand. Duke William saw the disaster unfolding. He had to stop the rout immediately. He removed his helmet, rode forward into view of his fleeing troops, and shouted that he was alive. Rumours that William had been killed sometimes sparked routs. Soldiers who believed their commander was dead would flee. William's personal appearance, showing he was alive and still commanding, steadied his troops. He rallied them. The retreat stopped. The army reformed. The English soldiers, who had broken formation and pursued, were now isolated and vulnerable. William's cavalry, once reorganised, turned on them. The English soldiers were cut off from their main force. They were surrounded and killed. Their deaths weakened the English line. The main English force remained disciplined, but the loss of men and the psychological blow of seeing comrades slaughtered affected morale. The battle continued. Eventually, King Harold was killed. Traditional accounts say he was struck in the eye by an arrow, though this is debated. With Harold dead, the English defence collapsed. The Normans won. William became King of England. The Norman conquest transformed English society. Language, law, culture, and governance changed fundamentally. The English nobility was replaced by Norman lords. Feudalism was imposed. The English language absorbed thousands of French words. English history took a new direction. The wrong signal during the feigned retreat nearly cost William the battle. If the rout had continued, if William had not rallied his troops, the Normans might have been defeated. Harold would have remained king. England would not have been conquered. The cultural fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Norman that created medieval England would not have occurred. English might have remained a purely Germanic language. The trajectory of English history, and by extension the history of the English-speaking world, would have been different. A misunderstood signal, a moment of panic, a cavalry unit that fled when it should have held. These small errors nearly changed everything. William's quick thinking saved the day. But it was a close thing. A different outcome hung on that moment of confusion. The Battle of Hastings was decided by many factors. Yet this one incident, the wrong signal that caused a genuine retreat, was a critical juncture. If William had not recovered control, history would have recorded a different result. A misspelled name on a treaty. Medieval diplomacy was conducted through written documents. Treaties, alliances, marriage contracts all required precise language. Scribes wrote these documents by hand. Latin was often used, as it was the common scholarly language across Europe. However, names of people and places had to be transliterated into Latin. This created opportunities for errors. A misspelled name could cause confusion or offence. In worse cases, it could invalidate agreements or spark conflicts. In the 13th century, two minor kingdoms in Central Europe negotiated a treaty. The details are obscure, lost to history's gaps, but the outline of the story survives. The treaty involved territorial boundaries and trade rights. Representatives met, discussed terms, and reached agreement. A scribe was tasked with writing the official document. Copies would be made. Each ruler would sign and seal their copy. The treaty would become binding. The scribe worked carefully. He wrote in Latin, transcribing the negotiated terms. One clause involved a town that would change hands, being transferred from one kingdom to another. The town's name was complex, with sounds that did not translate easily into Latin. The scribe did his best. He wrote what he thought he heard. The name he wrote was close, but not exact. A letter was changed. The town he named in the treaty was not the town the negotiators had discussed. It was a different town, similar name, but located elsewhere. Neither kingdom's representative noticed the error immediately. The treaty was copied, signatures and seals were affixed. The documents were delivered to each ruler. The treaty was proclaimed. Both kingdoms believed they had a clear agreement. Months passed. The time came to implement the territorial transfer. The kingdom that was supposed to cede the town prepared to hand it over. Officials arrived at the towns specified in the negotiated talks. They expected representatives from the other kingdom to take control. However, the other kingdom sent officials to a different town, the one actually named in the written treaty. The two groups of officials arrived at different locations. Confusion arose. Messengers were sent. The kingdoms consulted their copies of the treaty. One side insisted the treaty clearly named one town. The other side insisted they had negotiated for a different town. Both sides were correct in a sense. The oral negotiations specified one town. The written document specified another. Negotiations reopened, but in bad faith. Each side accused the other of deception. The kingdom supposed to receive the town demanded the better of the two towns, the one they claimed was originally agreed upon. The other kingdom refused, pointing to the written treaty. Tensions escalated, diplomatic language turned hostile, threats were made. Both kingdoms mobilized troops, not for invasion, but as shows of force. Neighboring kingdoms observed the dispute. Some saw opportunity. Alliances shifted. A third kingdom, previously neutral, offered to mediate. The mediation failed. Pride and suspicion prevented compromise. Minor skirmishes occurred along the border. Full war was narrowly avoided, but relations between the two kingdoms remained poisoned for years. Trade suffered. Alliances that might have formed did not. Both kingdoms were weakened diplomatically. Eventually, decades later, the dispute was resolved through a marriage alliance. A prince from one kingdom married a princess from the other. As part of the marriage contract, the territorial dispute was settled. Both towns were acknowledged as belonging to their current holders. The error was effectively forgiven, buried under new agreements. But the damage had been done. Years of hostility, missed opportunities, and mistrust resulted from a scribe's misspelling. The scribe likely never knew the consequences of his error. He wrote what he thought was correct. He could not have foreseen that a single letter, a misheard syllable, would cause diplomatic crisis. Yet words matter. Precise language is essential in agreements. A small error in transcription created ambiguity. Ambiguity created dispute. Dispute created hostility. The misspelled name was a tiny mistake with outsized impact. A Japanese archer slips before firing. Feudal Japan was marked by conflict between rival clans and warlords. Battles decided control of territories. Honor and reputation mattered as much as military strength. Samurai followed strict codes. The beginning of a battle often involved formalities. Champions challenged each other. Signals marked the start of fighting. Discipline was paramount. Acting prematurely could bring shame. In the late 12th century, two armies faced each other across a field. Both sides were arrayed, waiting for the signal to attack. Archers stood ready. Cavalry prepared to charge. Foot soldiers gripped their weapons. The tension was palpable. Both commanders observed each other, looking for signs of weakness. The battle would begin when one side signaled attack, or when mutual understanding made further delay pointless. Among the archers on one side was a young warrior eager to prove himself. He was skilled with the bow. He had trained extensively, but he was inexperienced in actual combat. His hands were steady, but his nerves were taut. He nocked an arrow, drew his bow, and waited for the command to shoot. The signal had not been given. He was to hold until ordered. The ground where he stood was uneven. His foot rested on a small stone. As he shifted his weight, adjusting his stance, the stone rolled. His foot slipped. He stumbled slightly, struggling to keep balance. In the moment of instability, his fingers released the bowstring. The arrow flew. It arced across the space between the armies. It was not aimed, it was an accident. The arrow struck the ground near the enemy line, harming no one, but the release of the arrow was interpreted as a signal. The opposing side, seeing an arrow fired, assumed the attack had begun. Their archers responded immediately, loosing volleys of arrows. Hundreds of arrows filled the air, descending on the young warrior's army. Men fell, struck by the sudden barrage. Chaos erupted. The young warrior's commander, seeing his men under attack, ordered a counterattack. His archers shot back. Cavalry charged. The battle began in confusion and disorder. The premature start disadvantaged the young warrior's army. They had not finished positioning, some units were not ready. The careful plans for the battle's opening were discarded. They reacted instead of acting. The opposing army, though also surprised, responded quickly. They had momentum, the battle raged, casualties mounted. By day's end, the young warrior's side was defeated. Many died. The commander was killed, the clan's power was broken. The young warrior survived the battle, but he was haunted by what he had done. His accidental arrow release had started the battle prematurely and in the wrong way. His mistake had cost his side any advantage. He could have contributed to defeat. In a culture that valued honor above all, this was unbearable. He contemplated seppuku, ritual suicide, to atone. Whether he carried through, history does not clearly record. Some accounts say he did. Others suggest he lived in obscurity, never speaking of the battle again. The consequences of the slip, the rolling stone under a foot, the released arrow, shaped the political landscape. The victorious clan expanded its territory, the defeated clan fragmented, alliances shifted, the balance of power in the region changed. The battle's outcome influenced events for decades, and it all began with an accidental arrow fired because a young warrior slipped. A monk adds a 0 to an annal. Medieval monasteries were centres of learning and record-keeping. Monks copied manuscripts, preserving ancient texts and recording contemporary events. Annals, year-by-year records of significant occurrences, were maintained. These documents are valuable to historians, providing timelines of medieval life. However, monks were human. They made errors. Copying by hand in dim light using quill and ink was painstaking. Mistakes happened. In the 9th century, a monk in a monastery in what is now Germany was copying an annal. The original manuscript was old and damaged. Some sections were difficult to read. The monk worked carefully, transcribing dates and events. One entry recorded an event in the year 750. The monk wrote the numeral, however, he made an error. He added an extra 0. The date he recorded was 7,500. This was an absurd date, far in the future from when the event actually occurred. But the monk did not notice. He was tired, perhaps. The candlelight flickered. He continued copying. The manuscript was completed. It was shelved in the monastery's library. Over time, other monks used this manuscript as a source. They copied it, perpetuating the error. The incorrect date spread through multiple manuscripts. Centuries later, scholars studying medieval chronology encountered the conflicting dates. Some manuscripts recorded an event in 750. Others recorded the same event in 7,500. This created confusion. Which date was correct? The event described was historically important, a battle or a king's coronation. Getting the date right mattered for understanding the sequence of historical events. Scholars debated. Some sided with one date, others argued for the other. The debate became contentious. Reputations were staked on being correct. Books and treatises were written, analysing evidence. The error propagated through academic discourse. Timelines of medieval history were disrupted. Events were placed in wrong centuries in some scholarly works. Confusion spread. The error was eventually identified and corrected, but not for hundreds of years. By then, the false date had influenced countless historical interpretations. Some conclusions drawn from the incorrect chronology were flawed. Relationships between events understood as cause and effect were misinterpreted because dates were wrong. Later, historians had to untangle the mess, re-examining sources and rebuilding timelines. The monk who added the 0 never knew his mistake. He lived and died without awareness that his error would confuse scholars for centuries. The consequence was not as dramatic as a war or a death. It was intellectual and historiographical. Understanding of the past was distorted. This distortion affected how later generations understood their history and identity. A single digit, an extra 0, misplaced by a tired monk, and the clarity of historical knowledge was obscured. A poorly tied knot sinks a ship. Ships in the age of sail were complex machines. Hundreds of ropes controlled sails and rigging. Each rope had a purpose. Knots had to be tied correctly. A poorly tied knot could come undone under stress, causing a sail to fail or a spar to break loose. Sailors were trained rigorously in knot tying. It was a basic but essential skill. Lives depended on it. In the early 18th century, a merchant ship departed from England bound for the Caribbean. The ship carried trade goods, textiles, metal tools, and other manufactured items to exchange for sugar and tobacco. The crew was experienced. The captain was a veteran of many voyages. The ship was well maintained. The weather was favourable. Everything suggested a routine voyage. Among the crew was a new sailor, young and eager, but still learning. He was assigned routine tasks, including securing cargo and maintaining rigging. One task involved tying a specific rope that held a block and tackle system. This system controlled a lower sail. The sailor tied the knot. He believed it was secure. He had learned the knot during training, but he made a small error. One loop was not seated correctly. The knot looked right, but was subtly weak. Days into the voyage, the ship encountered a storm. Storms were common in the Atlantic. The crew was prepared. They reefed sails, reducing sail area to manage the wind. The ship rode out the storm, tossed by waves, but holding steady. As the storm intensified, strain increased on every part of the rigging. Ropes tightened, knots were tested. The poorly tied knot began to slip. The loop that was not seated correctly pulled through. The knot came undone. The rope it held went slack. The block and tackle system failed. The sail it controlled, a lower sail providing crucial stability, began to flap wildly. The sail was no longer secured. It thrashed in the wind, pulling at other rigging. The strain caused a spar to crack. The spar, a wooden beam supporting the sail, broke. It swung loose, a massive piece of wood swinging uncontrollably. Sailors rushed to secure the broken spar and the loose sail. It was dangerous work. The ship heaved in the waves. Men climbed rigging in the storm, trying to tie down the thrashing sail and broken spar. One sailor was struck by the swinging spar. He fell from the rigging into the sea. The ship could not stop to recover him. He was lost. The crew managed to secure the damage, cutting away the broken spar and tying down the remnants of the sail. The ship was now crippled. With one sail gone and the rigging damaged, maneuverability was reduced. Speed dropped. The storm pushed the ship off course. Navigation became difficult. The captain tried to compensate, steering as best he could, but the ship was driven toward a rocky coastline. Visibility was poor. The crew did not see the danger until too late. The ship struck rocks. The hull breached. Water poured in. The captain ordered the crew to the boats. They abandoned ship in the middle of the storm. Some boats capsized in the heavy seas. Men drowned. Others reached shore, exhausted and battered. The ship sank. The cargo was lost. The expedition was a total failure. Investigation after the disaster sought to understand what went wrong. Survivors recounted the sequence of events: the failure of the rigging, the broken spar, the loss of control. When the rope and the failed knot were examined, recovered from wreckage, the error was identified. A knot had been tied incorrectly. One simple mistake in knot tying had started a chain reaction that sank the ship. The young sailor who tied the knot survived. He lived with the knowledge that his error had killed shipmates and destroyed the ship. He never sailed again. The memory was too heavy. A knot, a basic task, done imperfectly, and lives were lost. Ships were valuable. Cargo was expensive, but more than money was lost. Men died because a rope came loose. The poorly tied knot became a symbol in the maritime community of why competence in basic skills mattered. Attention to detail saved lives. Negligence killed. A lamp left, burning in Alexandria. The Library of Alexandria was one of the ancient world's greatest repositories of knowledge. Founded in the 3rd century before the Common Era in Egypt, it housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Scholars from across the Mediterranean came to study. The library was more than a building. It was a symbol of learning and intellectual achievement. Its destruction is one of history's great tragedies. The exact details of how the library was destroyed are debated. Multiple incidents over centuries contributed. But one account, passed down through fragmented sources, attributes a significant fire to a simple accident. In the 1st century before the Common Era, during the period when Rome increasingly dominated Egypt, the library was still functioning. Scholars worked late into the night. Oil lamps provided light. Scrolls were made of papyrus, a plant-based material that burned easily. Fire was a constant danger. Strict rules governed lamp use. Lamps were supposed to be extinguished before leaving a room. Scholars were careful, aware of the risk. One evening, a scholar was working in a reading room. He was transcribing a text, copying a scroll to create a duplicate. The work was tedious. Hours passed. Late into the night, exhausted, he decided to stop. He gathered his materials. He intended to extinguish the lamp, but he was tired. His mind was on his work, on the text he had been copying. He left the room, forgetting the lamp. It continued to burn. The lamp's oil reservoir had enough fuel for several more hours. The flame burned steadily. The room was quiet. No one else was present. The scholar went to his quarters. He fell asleep. The lamp burned through the night. At some point, the flame, perhaps disturbed by a draught, or by the lamp's position shifting slightly as oil was consumed, came near a scroll left on the table. The papyrus caught fire. The scroll burned quickly. Flames spread to other scrolls on nearby shelves. Papyrus is highly flammable. Within minutes, the fire grew. Smoke filled the room. By the time someone noticed, flames had engulfed the reading room. Alarms were raised. People rushed with water. They formed bucket chains, trying to douse the flames. But the fire spread faster than they could fight it. Scrolls ignited. Shelves burned. The wooden roof caught fire. The library complex was large. Not all of it burned. Other sections were saved by the efforts of those fighting the fire and by stone walls that limited the spread. But the reading room and adjacent storage areas were destroyed. Thousands of scrolls burned. Some were unique copies, texts that existed nowhere else in the world. Knowledge accumulated over centuries turned to ash in hours. The loss was incalculable. The scholar who left the lamp burning was devastated. He had not intended harm. He had simply forgotten, but the consequences were catastrophic. Some sources suggest he took his own life, unable to bear the guilt. Others say he was exiled or imprisoned. The exact fate is unclear. The library's administrators implemented stricter fire safety rules. Lamps were removed entirely from some sections. Guards patrolled at night, checking for fire hazards. But the damage was done. The scrolls, lost, could not be recovered. The Library of Alexandria suffered multiple disasters over the centuries. Julius Caesar's troops may have accidentally burned part of it during a military action. Later fires, neglect, and deliberate destruction by various parties contributed to its decline. By the time the library finally ceased to exist, centuries after its founding, much of its collection was gone. The loss of the Library of Alexandria is mourned as a tragedy for human knowledge. Texts by ancient philosophers, scientists, poets, all lost. We will never know what insights, discoveries, or stories were contained in those vanished scrolls. The lamp left burning was not the sole cause of the library's destruction, but it was one incident in a series of disasters. Each loss diminished the collection. Cumulatively, they destroyed it. One forgetful scholar, one burning lamp, one room full of scrolls reduced to ashes, a small error contributing to a historical catastrophe. A scout misreads tracks in Mongolia. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan expanded with terrifying speed in the early 13th century. Mongol armies were highly mobile, disciplined, and effective. Their success depended on intelligence. Scouts ranged ahead of the main army, gathering information about terrain, enemy positions, and potential threats. Accurate scouting allowed Mongol commanders to plan strategies and avoid ambushes. Errors in reconnaissance could be costly. During one of the early campaigns, a Mongol army was moving through unfamiliar territory. The scouts were experienced, skilled at reading tracks and signs. They could determine from footprints how many people or animals had passed, how recently, and in what direction. They scouted ahead, reporting back to the main force. Their information guided the army's movements. One scout examined tracks in the dirt near a river crossing. He saw footprints and signs of passage. He interpreted them as belonging to a small group, perhaps refugees or traders. The tracks suggested a non-threatening presence, people moving away from the Mongol advance. The scout reported this to his commander. The commander, trusting the scout's expertise, decided the area was safe. The army proceeded toward the river crossing, intending to cross and continue the advance. However, the scout had misread the tracks. What he interpreted as a small group was actually the trail of a much larger force. An enemy army had passed through the area recently. They had used the river crossing. Their tracks overlapped, creating confusion. The scout, perhaps tired or hasty, had not examined them carefully enough. He missed signs that indicated large numbers. The enemy force was nearby, not far ahead, and they were aware of the Mongol approach. The enemy had set an ambush. They concealed their forces in the terrain near the river crossing, in gullies and behind ridges. When the Mongol army reached the crossing, the enemy attacked. Arrows flew from concealed positions. Cavalry charged from hidden ravines. The Mongols were caught unprepared. They had expected no resistance. Instead, they faced a well-organized ambush. The Mongol army reacted quickly, as trained warriors do. They formed defensive positions. They returned fire. Cavalry units maneuvered to flank the attackers. But the initial surprise cost them. Casualties were heavy in the first minutes. Commanders struggled to assess the situation and coordinate responses. The ambush disrupted the Mongol advance. The battle was fierce. Eventually, the Mongols, with superior discipline and tactics, fought their way out of the ambush. They inflicted significant casualties on the enemy and forced them to retreat. But the Mongols had suffered losses. More importantly, the campaign was delayed. The element of surprise was lost. The enemy, having bloodied the Mongols, gained confidence. Resistance stiffened in the region. The scout who misread the tracks was punished. Mongol discipline was harsh. Errors that endangered the army were not tolerated. The scout may have been demoted, flogged, or executed depending on the commander's judgment. The exact consequence is not recorded. But the lesson was clear. Scouting was critical. Errors had severe consequences. The ambush did not destroy the Mongol army. They continued the campaign and eventually conquered the region. But the delay and losses affected the broader strategy. Resources were expended, time was lost. Other opportunities might have been pursued instead. The misread tracks, a small intelligence failure, had ripple effects. One scout's error, interpreting overlapping tracks as a small group instead of a large force, led to an ambush, casualties, and strategic complications. In war, small mistakes can be very expensive. A Persian soldier drops his shield. Ancient battles were chaotic. Thousands of men fought in close quarters. Noise, dust, fear, and adrenaline created confusion. Soldiers relied on training and discipline. Orders were communicated through signals, horns, and shouts. In the din of battle, maintaining formation was critical. Breaking formation could lead to disaster. Soldiers protected each other with overlapping shields, creating a wall. If one soldier's shield dropped, it created a gap that enemies could exploit. In the 5th century before the Common Era, the Persian Empire was the dominant power in the Near East. Persian armies were large, well-equipped, and experienced. During one campaign, Persian forces engaged an enemy army in open battle. Both sides arrayed their troops. Infantry formed the center. Cavalry protected the flanks. Archers prepared to loose volleys. The battle began with the clash of the infantry lines. Among the Persian infantry was a soldier holding a large shield. These shields, called hoplon-style shields in Greek or similar designs in Persian service, were heavy and cumbersome. They provided excellent protection but required strength to hold. The soldier had fought before. He was competent but not exceptional. The battle's intensity grew. Men pushed against each other, shields pressed together, spears thrust between gaps. The soldier's position was in the front line. He held his shield up, protecting himself and partially protecting the man beside him. The formation depended on each soldier maintaining their position. The noise was overwhelming. Men shouted, metal clashed, wounded men screamed. The soldier's arm ached from holding the heavy shield. Sweat poured down his face. He struggled to see through the chaos. An enemy spear thrust toward him. He deflected it with his shield, but the impact jarred his arm. His grip loosened. In the split second of distraction, combined with fatigue, his fingers slipped. The shield dropped. It fell to the ground. The soldier was exposed, so was the man beside him, whose own shield now had to cover a wider area. The enemy saw the gap. An experienced enemy soldier thrust his spear through the opening. The point struck the Persian soldier in the chest. He fell. The man beside him, trying to cover the gap, was also vulnerable. Another enemy attack struck him. He staggered. The formation wavered. More men fell. The gap widened. Panic began to spread through that section of the Persian line. Soldiers saw their comrades falling. They stepped back. The line bulged inward. The enemy pressed the advantage. They pushed forward, exploiting the weak point. The Persian commander, observing from a distance, saw the crisis. He ordered reserves to shore up the line. Fresh troops rushed in, filling the gap. The battle stabilized, but not before significant losses occurred. The section of the line where the shield dropped suffered disproportionate casualties. The momentum shifted temporarily to the enemy. The battle continued for hours. Eventually, the Persians prevailed, but at greater cost than anticipated. The dropped shield was not the sole reason for the losses, but it was a contributing factor. One soldier's moment of weakness, a dropped shield, created an opportunity for the enemy. That opportunity cost lives and nearly caused a collapse. The soldier who dropped his shield died quickly. He did not live to know the consequences of his mistake. His comrades knew. They saw the gap, the deaths, the near disaster. After the battle, discussions among survivors noted what went wrong. The lesson was repeated. Never drop your shield. Hold the line. Protect your comrades. The individual action mattered to the collective survival. A Roman engineer misplaces a measurement. The Roman Empire was renowned for engineering. Roads, bridges, aqueducts, and public buildings demonstrated Roman technical skill. Aqueducts, in particular, were marvels. They transported water from distant sources to cities, using gravity to maintain flow over long distances. Designing an aqueduct required precise calculations. The gradient had to be correct. Too steep, and water flowed too fast, eroding channels. Too shallow, and water stagnated or did not reach the destination. Roman engineers mastered these calculations, but errors could occur. In the 2nd century of the Common Era, an aqueduct was being constructed to supply water to a provincial city in Gaul, modern-day France. The aqueduct would run for dozens of kilometers, crossing valleys and hills. The chief engineer surveyed the route. He calculated elevations, slopes, and distances. He prepared detailed plans. Construction teams began work, following the plans. At one section, the aqueduct had to cross a valley. The engineer planned a series of arches to support the channel at the necessary height. The arches would carry the water across the valley, maintaining the gradient. The engineer calculated the required height for the arches based on surveyed elevations. He noted the measurements in his documents. However, he made an error. When transcribing a measurement from his surveying notes to the construction plans, he misread a figure. One digit was transposed. The height he specified for the arches was several meters lower than it should have been. The construction teams followed the plans. They built the arches to the specified height. The work was skillful. The arches were solid, beautifully constructed. When the section was completed, the aqueduct channel was installed on top of the arches. The project moved forward. The engineer was busy with other sections. He did not revisit the completed work. The error went unnoticed. Months later, the entire aqueduct was finished. Water was released into the channel at the source. It flowed through the initial section successfully. But when it reached the valley crossing, problems appeared. The gradient was wrong. The section on the arches was too low. Water could not flow properly through that section. It pooled, overflowed and leaked. The aqueduct did not deliver water to the city as intended. The engineer returned to investigate. He reviewed his plans and surveyed the structure. He recalculated. He discovered his error. The arches were built lower than necessary because he had transposed a digit in the measurement. The mistake was his. The consequences were significant. The aqueduct did not function. The city remained without the water supply they desperately needed. Population growth had strained existing wells and springs. Water shortages caused hardship. Repairing the error was expensive and time-consuming. The arches could not simply be raised, they had to be demolished and rebuilt to the correct height. This required additional funds, labour, and months of work. The city's authorities were furious. The engineer's reputation was destroyed. He may have faced financial penalties or criminal charges, depending on local laws and the severity of judgment. The city endured another year without adequate water. Eventually, the corrected section was completed. The aqueduct functioned. Water flowed into the city. Life improved, but the delay and extra cost were burdens. Resources that could have been used for other projects were consumed fixing the mistake. The engineer's misplaced measurement, a transposed digit, a simple clerical error, had cascading consequences. Infrastructure failed. A city suffered. Lives were disrupted. The lesson was clear. Precision mattered. A single wrong number could undermine months of labour and investment. A Viking misjudges the tide at Lindisfarne. The Viking raid on Lindisfarne in 793 of the Common Era is often cited as the beginning of the Viking Age. Lindisfarne was a monastery on a tidal island off the northeast coast of England. The monastery was wealthy, holding treasures accumulated through donations and royal patronage. It was also vulnerable. Monasteries were not fortified. Monks were not warriors. They relied on isolation and the sanctity of their religious status for protection. A Viking crew in longships sailed along the English coast, seeking targets. They spotted Lindisfarne. The monastery was accessible at low tide when a causeway connected the island to the mainland. At high tide, the island was cut off. Timing was crucial for a raid. The Vikings needed to land, raid, and depart before defenders could arrive, or before the tide trapped them. The Viking leader planned the raid. He observed the tides. He intended to attack at low tide, allowing easy access. His crew would cross the causeway, enter the monastery, take valuables, and retreat before high tide returned. Speed was essential. The plan seemed straightforward. However, the leader miscalculated the tide schedule. He was unfamiliar with the local tidal patterns. The North Sea's tides are complex, influenced by local geography. The leader's experience from other coasts did not translate perfectly. The Vikings landed at what they thought was low tide. The causeway was passable. They crossed onto the island. They reached the monastery. The monks were shocked. They had no warning, no defences. The Vikings looted. They took gold, silver, religious artefacts. They killed some monks. Others fled or were captured. The raid was brutal and efficient. However, the Viking leader's timing was off. The tide turned faster than he expected. By the time the Vikings had gathered their plunder and prepared to leave, the causeway was submerged. The water was deep, too deep to wade through with heavy treasure. The longships, drawn up on the beach, were not positioned for quick departure. The crew hurried, but the rising water complicated everything. They loaded ships hastily. Some treasure was dropped or lost. Men waded through surf, struggling with weight and waves. A local response materialized. Nearby villagers, seeing smoke or hearing the commotion, mustered a force. They were not soldiers, but farmers and townspeople armed with whatever weapons they had. They reached the shore opposite the island. They saw the Vikings struggling with the tide. The villagers could not cross to the island, but they assembled, shouting and making threatening gestures. Their presence added pressure on the Vikings to leave quickly. The Vikings managed to load most of their ships and pushed off, but the tide and the rushed departure cost them. One ship ran aground on submerged rocks. It damaged the hull. Water leaked in. The crew bailed frantically. They managed to reach deeper water, but the ship was compromised. Later, in open sea, the damage worsened. The ship sank. The crew, the treasure, all lost to the waves. The other ships escaped. They returned to Scandinavia with significant plunder. the raid was considered a success overall. News of the wealth and vulnerability of English monasteries spread. More raids followed. Lindisfarne's destruction shocked Christendom. It symbolized the violence of the Viking Age, but for the Vikings themselves, the raid had a costly side. The misjudged tide led to a lost ship, drowned men, and lost treasure. The success could have been greater if the timing had been right. A Chinese alchemist spills a mixture. In ancient China, alchemists sought the elixir of immortality. Emperors funded their research. Alchemists experimented with various substances, heating, mixing, and combining them in search of transformative properties. They used sulfur, charcoal, saltpeter, and other materials. They did not understand chemistry in the modern sense. They worked through trial and error, guided by philosophical theories. Their goal was spiritual and mystical, but their methods were practical. During the Tang dynasty, around the 9th century, an alchemist worked in his laboratory. He had been combining sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter in various proportions, heating them and observing the results. Most combinations did nothing remarkable. They might smoke or produce foul smells. The alchemist recorded his results meticulously. He was patient, willing to try countless variations. One day he prepared a mixture. He ground the ingredients into fine powders. He mixed them in a specific ratio. He poured the mixture into a container, intending to heat it, but as he moved the container, he fumbled. His hands were not as steady as they should have been. Perhaps he was tired, perhaps distracted. The container slipped, the mixture spilled, powder scattered across the floor and onto a nearby brazier, a small charcoal fire used for heating. The spilled powder fell into the hot coals. It ignited. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. A burst of flame and smoke erupted. A loud bang echoed in the confined space. The alchemist was thrown back by the force. He was burned, though not severely. Acrid smoke filled the room. He stumbled out, coughing, eyes streaming. He extinguished the fire. He examined the damage. The brazier was scorched. The floor was charred. The mixture was gone, consumed in the explosion. The alchemist was shaken. He had never seen such a violent reaction. He pondered what had happened. He had not been seeking an explosive. He had been looking for transformative agents for his elixirs, but here was something new and dangerous. He recorded the incident carefully, noting the proportions of the mixture and the result. He experimented further, cautiously. He refined the mixture. He discovered that certain ratios produced the explosive effect reliably. This was the discovery of gunpowder. The alchemist's accidental spill led to the identification of a compound with properties unlike anything known before. Word of the discovery spread among alchemists and eventually to military engineers. They recognized the potential. If a small amount could explode, larger amounts could be used as weapons. Experimentation continued. By the 10th century, gunpowder was being used in Chinese warfare. Fire arrows, bombs, and eventually cannons and rockets followed. The invention of gunpowder transformed warfare. It ended the dominance of armoured cavalry. Fortifications had to adapt to withstand cannon fire. Gunpowder technology spread from China to the Middle East and eventually to Europe. By the late medieval period, gunpowder weapons were standard in European armies. The nature of war changed. Battles became more lethal. The social and political impacts were profound, all from a spilled mixture. An alchemist's accidental fumble led to one of history's most significant technological discoveries. He was not seeking a weapon. He was not trying to change warfare. He was looking for immortality. Instead, he found a substance that would kill millions and alter the course of human history. The accident, the spilled powder falling into hot coals, was a moment of chance that redirected human development. A Norse carpenter misaligns a board. The Norse colonies in Greenland, established in the late 10th century, represented one of the most remote and precarious European settlements. Norse settlers brought their shipbuilding skills. Ships were essential. They connected Greenland to Iceland, Norway, and even briefly to North America. Without ships, the colonies were isolated. Resupply, trade, and communication all depended on seaworthy vessels. Building a Norse longship, or gnar, a cargo ship, required skilled carpentry. The ships were clinker-built. Overlapping planks formed the hull, held together by iron rivets. The keel was the foundation. Every plank had to be cut and fitted precisely. The ship had to be strong enough to withstand North Atlantic storms. Even a small error in construction could weaken the vessel. In one of the Greenland settlements in the 11th century, a carpenter was building a nar. This ship would carry trade goods, people, and supplies between Greenland and Iceland. The community depended on it. The carpenter was experienced but aging. His hands were not as steady as they once were. His eyesight was failing. He worked with assistants, young men learning the craft. During construction, the carpenter fitted a plank to the keel. This plank was critical, part of the ship's bottom. It had to align correctly with the keel and the adjacent planks. The carpenter measured, marked, and fitted the plank, but his measurement was slightly off. The alignment was not precise. The plank angled subtly away from where it should have been. The error was small, a matter of centimeters, barely noticeable. The rivets were driven. The plank was fixed in place. The construction continued. Other planks were fitted above. The ship took shape. When completed, it looked fine. It was launched. Initial trials seemed successful. The ship sailed well in calm waters near the coast. The community celebrated. The ship would soon undertake its first long voyage to Iceland, carrying goods to trade for grain and timber, both scarce in Greenland. The voyage began. The ship carried a crew and valuable cargo. The weather was good initially, but in the North Atlantic, weather changes quickly. A storm arose. Winds howled. Waves grew mountainous. The ship laboured. Water pounded the hull. Stress increased on every joint and plank. The misaligned plank, under this extreme stress, began to fail. The joint was weaker than it should have been. Water seeped in. The seepage became a leak. The crew tried to bail, but the leak worsened. The planking split. Water poured in faster than they could remove it. The ship was doomed. The crew abandoned it, taking to a small boat they carried. The nar sank. The cargo was lost. The crew survived, reaching land after a harrowing night in the small boat. But the ship, representing months of labour and valuable resources, was gone. The community was devastated. They had invested heavily in the ship. The lost cargo would have brought essential supplies. Without the ship, the settlement was more isolated. Trade was disrupted. The carpenter who built the ship was blamed. He was old. His error, whether from failing eyesight or momentary inattention, had cost the community dearly. He lived the rest of his life in shame. Some accounts suggest he was exiled or took his own life. The exact consequence is lost to history. The loss of the ship, combined with other challenges, weakened the settlement. Over the following decades, conditions in Greenland deteriorated. Climate cooled. Trade became more difficult. Eventually, the Norse colonies in Greenland were abandoned. The last settlers either died or left. The Greenland Norse became a lost chapter, their settlements vanishing. While many factors contributed to the collapse, each setback mattered. The loss of a critical ship, sunk because a carpenter misaligned a plank, was one thread in a pattern of failures that ended the Norse presence in Greenland. A deal signed, without reading the fine lines. Medieval politics involved complex alliances, marriages, and treaties. Powerful lords negotiated agreements that affected territories and populations. Documents were written in Latin, often in dense legal language. Not all nobles were literate or skilled in legal interpretation. They relied on advisors, scribes, and clerics to read and explain documents. But misunderstandings occurred. Sometimes, a lord signed an agreement without fully understanding its terms. In the 14th century, a minor lord in a region of Central Europe negotiated with a more powerful neighbour. The powerful lord offered an alliance. He would provide military support in exchange for certain concessions. The minor lord, facing threats from other rivals, was eager for the alliance. Negotiations occurred, terms were discussed orally. Both sides reached a basic understanding. The powerful lord's scribes prepared a written treaty. The document was in Latin. It was long, filled with legal terminology. The minor lord was presented with the document. His own clerks read portions of it aloud. The general terms seemed to match the oral agreement. Military support would be provided. Certain taxes and duties would be paid. The minor lord would acknowledge the powerful lord's overlordship in specific matters. However, buried in the fine lines of the document, in clauses written in convoluted language, were additional terms. These clauses granted the powerful lord rights to certain territories if the minor lord died without heirs. They included provisions that, under specific circumstances, allowed the powerful lord to appoint officials in the minor lord's lands. These terms had not been discussed openly. They were included intentionally, hidden in legal language, hoping the minor lord would not notice. The minor lord was impatient. He wanted the alliance secured. He trusted the broad terms presented to him. He did not read the entire document carefully. His clerks, perhaps not fully understanding the legal nuances, did not catch the hidden clauses. The minor lord signed and sealed the treaty. The powerful lord countersigned. The agreement was binding. Years passed. The minor lord benefited from the alliance. He felt secure. Then a situation arose. The minor lord's only son died. The lord had no other legitimate heirs. According to the treaty's hidden clauses, this event triggered the powerful lord's rights to claim certain territories. The powerful lord invoked the treaty. He demanded control of key castles and lands. The minor lord protested. He claimed this was not what he agreed to. The written treaty was brought forth. The clauses were there, in black ink, signed and sealed. The minor lord's own signature was below. Legally, he had agreed. Disputes arose. The minor lord refused to comply, arguing he had been deceived. The powerful lord, having the legal document, insisted on enforcement. The dispute escalated. The powerful lord mobilized troops. The minor lord resisted. Minor skirmishes occurred. Neighboring lords chose sides. The conflict expanded beyond the two original parties. Years of intermittent warfare followed. Territories changed hands. People suffered. Eventually, a settlement was reached through mediation, but by then both sides were weakened. The minor lord lost some territories. The powerful lord did not gain everything he wanted. Both spent resources and blood for an outcome neither desired. The initial mistake, signing without reading the fine lines, created the conditions for conflict. If the minor lord had been more careful, if he had insisted on understanding every clause, he might have negotiated different terms or refused to sign. But impatience, trust, and inadequate advice led him to bind himself to an agreement he did not fully understand. The hidden clauses were exploitation, but they were legal. The minor lord had no recourse except force, and force is expensive. A Sumerian scribe records the wrong omen. In ancient Sumer, the earliest known civilization in Mesopotamia, religion permeated daily life. Scribes recorded everything on clay tablets using cuneiform script. They documented laws, trade, and omens. Omens were signs from the gods, interpreted by priests. A sheep's liver might show patterns. The flight of birds might follow certain paths. Eclipses, storms, and unusual events were all omens. Scribes recorded omens and their interpretations. These records guided decisions from farming to warfare. A scribe in a Sumerian city, around 2,000 years before the Common Era, was tasked with recording an omen observed by priests. A lunar eclipse had occurred. The priests interpreted this as a sign regarding the coming agricultural season. Eclipses were serious. The gods were speaking. The interpretation was that the planting season should be delayed. The gods were not favourable for immediate planting. Waiting 2 weeks would align actions with divine will, ensuring a good harvest. The scribe listened to the priest. He inscribed their interpretation onto a clay tablet. But he made an error. Instead of writing that planting should be delayed, he wrote that planting should proceed immediately. Perhaps he misheard. Perhaps he was distracted. Perhaps his understanding of cuneiform symbols was imperfect. The error was made. The tablet was dried and stored in the city's archives. The priest, assuming the scribe recorded accurately, did not verify the tablet's content. They trusted him. The city's administrators consulted the archives when deciding agricultural policy. They read the tablet. It said to plant immediately. They issued orders. Farmers throughout the region began planting. Seed was sown. The timing, however, was wrong. It was too early. The soil was not ready. Late frosts had not yet passed. Within weeks, a cold snap occurred. Frost killed many of the newly sprouted plants. The early planting, undertaken because the tablet indicated divine approval, resulted in crop failure. The city faced food shortages. Stored grain from previous harvests was depleted. Hunger spread. The people protested. The priests were consulted. They reviewed the omen. They realized the timing of planting was wrong. They checked the archive tablet. They saw the error. The scribe had recorded the opposite of what they intended. The mistake was discovered, but too late. The damage was done. The scribe was punished. The exact punishment is not recorded, but Sumerian law was harsh. The scribe might have been fined, beaten, or executed, depending on how the error was judged. Regardless, the city suffered. The failed harvest meant hardship. Trade was required to acquire food. Resources were expended. The city's strength was sapped. Rival cities took advantage. The city lost influence in regional politics. An omen misrecorded by a scribe led to bad agricultural decisions. Those decisions led to crop failure. The failure led to hunger and weakness. A wrong symbol inscribed on a clay tablet, a simple error in transcription, and an entire city's fate worsened. The gods, according to Sumerian belief, had spoken clearly, but human error in recording and transmitting that divine message turned blessing into curse.